Hello and welcome to tonight's tale, The Tomb Legion, the final chapter of Herbert West, Reanimator. In tonight's thrilling conclusion, we finally learn the truth of Herbert West's disappearance. So, if this is your first part of Herbert West, then click the links in the description. The first will take you to the full playlist of Herbert West Reanimator, so you can get the full horrific experience. While the second link will take you to the playlist containing all of my immersive readings, the tales of the old ones. So, without further ado, I do need to give my quick little disclaimer, and then we can begin. Herbert West Reanimator does contain language that is offensive and correlates with outdated societal views. Due to the nature of these words, they have been changed with appropriate words or have been omitted altogether. Thank you for understanding, and I hope you enjoy tonight's tale. When Dr. Herbert West disappeared a year ago, the Boston police questioned me closely. They suspected that I was holding something back and perhaps suspected even graver things. But I could not tell them the truth because they would not believe it. They knew, indeed, that West had been connected with activities beyond the credence of ordinary men, for his hideous experiments in the reanimation of dead bodies had been long too extensive to admit of perfect secrecy, but the final soul-shattering catastrophe had elements of demonic fantasy which make even me doubt the reality of what I saw. I was West's closest friend, only confidential assistant. We had met years before, in medical school, and from the first I had shared his terrible researches. He had slowly tried to perfect a solution, which, injected into the veins of the newly deceased, would restore life, a labor demanding an abundance of fresh corpses and therefore involving most unnatural actions. Still more shocking were the products of some of the experiments. Grisly masses of flesh that had been dead, but that West had waked to a blind, brainless, nauseous animation. These were the usual results, for in order to reawaken the mind, it was necessary to have specimens so absolutely fresh that no decay could possibly affect the delicate brain cells. This need for very fresh corpses had been West's moral undoing. They were hard to get, and one awful day he had secured his specimen while it was still alive and vigorous. A struggle, a needle, and a powerful alkaloid had transformed it to a very fresh corpse. And the experiment had succeeded for a brief and memorable moment, but West had emerged with a soul calloused and seared, and a hardened eye which sometimes glanced with a kind of hideous and calculating appraisal of men, especially sensitive brain and especially vigorous physique. Toward the last, I became acutely afraid of West, for he began to look at me that way. People did not seem to notice his glances, but they noticed my fear, and after his disappearance, used that as a basis for some absurd suspicions. West, in reality, was more afraid than I, for his abominable pursuits entailed a life of furtiveness and dread of every shadow. Partly it was the police he feared, but sometimes his nervousness was deeper and more nebulous, touching on certain indescribable things into which he had injected a morbid life, and from which he had not seen that life depart. He usually finished his experiments with a revolver, but a few times he had not been quick enough. There was the first specimen on whose rifle grave marks a clawing were later seen. There was also that Arkham professor's body, which had done cannibal things before it had been captured and thus identified into a madhouse cell at Sefton, where it beat the walls for 16 years. Most of the other possibly surviving results were less easy to speak of, for in later years, West's scientific zeal had degenerated into an unhealthy and fantastic mania, and he had spent his chief skill in vitalizing not entire bodies, but isolated parts of bodies, or parts joined to organic matter rather than human. It had become fiendishly disgusting by the time he disappeared. Many of the experiments could not even be hinted at in print. The Great War, through which both of us served as surgeons, had intensified this side of the West. In saying that West's fear of specimens was nebulous, I have in my mind particularly its complex nature. Part of it came merely from knowing of the existence of such nameless monsters, while another part arose from apprehension of the bodily harm they might under circumstances do to him. Their disappearance added horror to the situation. Of them, all West knew the whereabouts of only one, the pitiful asylum thing. Then there was more subtle fear. a very fantastic sensation resulting from a curious experiment in the Canadian Army in 1915. West, in the midst of a severe battle, had reanimated Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, DSO, a fellow physician who knew about his experiments and could have duplicated them. The head had been removed so that the possibilities of quasi-intelligent life in the trunk might be investigated. Just as the building was wiped out by a German shell, there had been success. The trunk had moved intelligently, and, unbelievable to relate, we were both sickeningly sure that the articulate sounds had come from the detached head as it lay in the shadowy corner of the laboratory. The shell had been merciful, in a way, but West could never feel as certain as he wished that we too were the only survivors. He used to make shuddering conjectures about the possible actions of a headless physician with the power of reanimating the dead. West's last quarters were in a venerable house of much elegance overlooking one of the oldest burying grounds in Boston. He had chosen the place for purely symbolic and fantastically aesthetic reasons, since most of the interments were of the colonial period and therefore of little use to a scientist seeking very fresh bodies. The laboratory was in a sub-cellar secretly constructed by imported workmen and contained a huge incinerator for the quiet and complete disposal of such bodies, or fragments and synthetic mockeries of bodies, as might remain from the morbid experiments and unhallowed amusements of the owner. During the excavation of this cellar, the workmen had struck some exceedingly ancient masonry, undoubtedly connected with the old burying ground, yet far too deep to correspond with any known sepulchre therein. After a number of calculations, West decided that it represented some secret chamber beneath the tomb of the Averils, where the last interment had been made in 1768. I was with him when he studied the nitrous, dripping walls laid bare by the spades and mattocks of the men, and was prepared for the gruesome thrill which would attend the uncovering of centuries grave secrets. But for the first time, West's new timidity conquered his natural curiosity, and he betrayed his degenerating fiber by ordering the masonry left intact and plastered over. Thus it remained till that final, hellish night, part of the walls of the secret laboratory. I speak of West's decadence, but must add that it was a purely mental and intangible thing. Outwardly, he was the same to the last. Calm, cold, slight, and yellowed hair, with spectacled blue eyes and general aspect of youth which years and fears seemed never to change. He seemed calm even when he thought of that clawed grave and looked over his shoulder, even though he thought of the carnivorous thing that gnawed and pawed at Sefton bars. The end of Herbert West began one evening in our joint study when he was dividing his curious glance between newspaper and me. A strange headline item had struck at him from the crumpled pages, and a nameless Titan claw had seemed to reach down through 16 years. Something fearsome and incredible had happened at Sefton Asylum 50 miles away, stunning the neighborhood and baffling the police. In the small hours of the morning, a body of silent men had entered the grounds and their leader had aroused the attendants. He was a menacing military figure who talked without moving his lips and whose voice seemed almost ventriloquially connected with an immense black case he carried. His expressionless face was handsome, to the point of a radiant beauty, but had shocked the superintendent when the hall light fell on it, for it was a wax face with eyes of painted glass. Some nameless accident had befallen this man. A larger man guided his steps, a repellent hulk whose bluish face seemed half eaten away by some unknown malady. The speaker had asked for the custody of the cannibal monster committed from Arkham 16 years before, and upon being refused, gave a single which precipitated a shocking riot. The fiends had beaten, trampled, and bitten every attendant who did not flee, killing 4 and finally succeeding in the liberation of the monster. These victims, who could recall the event without hysteria, swore that the creature had acted less like men and then like unthinkable automata guided by the wax-faced leader. By the time help could be summoned, every trace of the men and their mad charge had vanished. From the hour of reading this item until midnight, West sat almost paralyzed. At midnight, the doorbell rang, startling him with fear. All the servants were asleep in the attic, so I answered the bell. As I have told the police, there was no wagon in the street, but only a group of strange-looking figures bearing a large square box, which they deposited in the hallway after one of them had grunted in a highly unnatural voice.
Express prepaid.
They filed out of the house with a jerky tread, and as I watched them go, I had an odd idea that they were turning toward the ancient cemetery on which the back of the house abutted. When I slammed the door after them, Wes came downstairs and looked at the box. It was about 2 feet square and bore Wes' correct name and present address. It also bore the inscription from Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, St. Eloi, Flanders. 6 years before, in Flanders, a shelled hospital had fallen upon the headless, reanimated trunk of Dr. Clapham Lee, and upon the detached head, which, perhaps, had uttered articulate sounds. West was not even excited now. His condition was more ghastly. Quickly, he said, "It's the finish, but let's incinerate this." We carried the thing to the laboratory. Listening, I did not remember many particulars. You can imagine my state of mind, but it is a vicious lie to say that it was Herbert West's body which I put in the incinerator. We both inserted the wholly unopened box, closed the door, and started the electricity. Nor did any sound come from the box, after all. It was West who noticed the falling plaster on part of the wall where the ancient tomb masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me. Then I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the charnel bowels of a putrescent earth. There was no sound. But then, just as the electric lights went out, and I saw outlined against some phosphorescence of the netherworld a horde of silent, toiling things which only insanity, or worse, could create. Their outlines were human, semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing the stones quietly, one by one, from the centuried wall. And then, as the breach became large enough, they came out into the laboratory in single file, led by a stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. A sort of mad-eyed monstrosity led the leader seized on Herbert West. West did not resist or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him and tore him to pieces before my eyes, bearing the fragments away into the subterranean vault of fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by the wax-headed leader, who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. As it disappeared, I saw the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Servants found me unconscious in the morning. West was gone. The incinerator contained only unidentifiable ashes. Detectives have questioned me, but what can I say? The Sefton tragedy, they will not connect with West. Not that, nor the men with the box, whose existence they deny. I told them of the vault, and they pointed to the unbroken plaster wall and laughed. So, I told them no more. They imply that I am either a madman or a murderer. Probably I am mad, but I might not be mad if those accursed tomb legions had not been so silent. And with that, the tale of Herbert West has drawn to a grisly close. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving it a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. As I mentioned before, links are in the description for the full Herbert West story, as well as my entire Tales from the Old Ones series. Thank you again, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Have a good night, and don't forget to check the basement before closing your eyes.